Well, let me begin this morning with a rather audacious statement. Jesus must have been a Republican. Well, now that I've got your attention and have potentially unsettled about half of you this morning, let me tell you why I am suggesting that Jesus was a Republican. Jesus must have been a Republican because he is halfway through his ministry. Crowds are thronging around. Jesus is riding high on a wave of popularity. He's teaching, he's healing, he's feeding 5,000, he's putting babies on his lap and kissing them. He is clearly the front runner in popularity among the people. And then, like Michelle Bachmann and Ron Paul and Mitt Romney and Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, Jesus comes out with the most audaciously bad soundbite. It's something akin to Newt's, well, let's put all the school-aged children of America to work as janitors and maids. Or Santorum's, John F. Kennedy's views on church and state make me want to throw up. Or Mitt Romney, I am proud to drive American cars. I drove a Mustang and a Chevy pickup truck, and my wife Ann drives 2 Cadillacs. Jesus says, the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. Clearly, Jesus could be one of our Republican presidential hopefuls this year, because after a brilliant start to his ministry, Jesus stumbles. Jesus has to open his big mouth and mess everything up. With the crowds thronging around him, Jesus says, the Son of Man must undergo suffering and be rejected and killed, and after 3 days rise again. And if you want to follow me, deny yourself. Take up your cross. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will save it. Jesus, like the entire field of Republican presidential candidates, needs a PR consultant. Jesus needs someone to warn him that in order to build a big church with lots of members, in order to be successful, you've got to figure out what people do and don't want to hear. And you've got to avoid messy subjects like sex or abortion or gun control or race or economics or politics. Also, you've got to make it simple and easy. Lots of talk about how much God loves you and how much God protects you and how much God will bless you and provide for you. None of this heavy stuff like losing your life or self-denial or taking up your cross or service. Here in the middle of Mark's gospel, Jesus starts blowing it. From this point forward, Jesus' ministry is on the downturn. Fewer people, more conflict, misunderstandings between Jesus and the religious leaders and the disciples and the government and the crowds. And finally, Jesus is abandoned by all but a few women who watch him die silently as he hangs on a cross. But not only does Jesus say that he will suffer himself, but Jesus says that anyone who wants to walk with him and be his disciple will have to do the same. Instead of promising that if you and I follow, things are going to look up for us, Jesus says that if you follow him, it's going to bring nothing but trouble and hardship into your life. 3 times in Mark's gospel, Jesus predicts his own suffering and death, and every time the disciples make it clear that they either don't understand or perhaps they understand just all too well, and they don't like what Jesus is saying. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, so if he repeats something once, let alone 3 times, it must be something of great importance. But something that Jesus says, this is something that Jesus says again and again in Mark's Gospel. If any want to become my followers, Let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save themselves will lose it. Surely Jesus doesn't mean what he says. I remember teaching this passage in Sunday school class, and when I was asked, what does Jesus mean? One honest student replied, my mother used to say that my father was the cross that she had to bear. But I hope that taking up one's cross is nothing more than dealing with the difficulties that you and I will inevitably face. I hope that cross-bearing doesn't mean what it sounds like, because I'll wager a few dollars, not $10,000, that life, your life and mine, is already probably hard enough. We probably don't need to look for any new burdens to bear. Why would Jesus want my life and yours to be any harder than it already is? That just doesn't make good sense. We all try to make our lives simpler. Who needs to make things any more complicated than they already are? We live in a selfish world that encourages self-absorption and self-actualization and self-advancement and self-assurance and self-improvement and self-interest and self-realization and self-respect and self-righteousness and self-fulfillment. Is it any wonder then that you and I set our sights on being healthy and wealthy and wise? We set our own agenda and follow where our ambitions lead us, just like everybody else. T.S. Eliot's play, The Cocktail Party, explores the empty lives of people living out of a pursuit of personal pleasure and ease of living, but they end up in despair. They go from relationship to relationship, from happy hour to happy hour, from psychologist to psychologist, and then one young woman discovers the self-emptying secret of Jesus, and she changes her life. She begins to serve others. She disappears from the social scene, and after 2 years, the word comes back that she's died. She was crucified on an anthill in a faraway island where she had been nursing plague-infected natives who would have died anyway. And her friends simply sip their drinks and cluck their tongues and murmur, "What a waste." Like those at Eliot's cocktail party, you and I have trouble even thinking in terms of sacrifice. We keep a safe distance from the ones that we're following. We find it hard to admit that self-denial is the central truth of Christian life. Following Jesus is not easy. Following Jesus is a whole lot of work. In Ibsen's play, An Enemy of the People, the main character is a health inspector named Stockman. He lives in a town dependent on the tourist trade and its renowned spas. When Stockman discovers that the town's water supply is contaminated and dangerous, he notifies the town leaders in order to avert possible catastrophe. To his surprise, the mayor rebukes him and tries to silence him. The citizens are outraged that this man wants to warn visitors. That would ruin their economy. But by the end of the play, Stockman is hated, he's outcast, he's unemployed, but he hasn't compromised. Finding refuge in what he knows to be true, his final line is, "The strongest person in the world is the one who stands alone." He lost nearly everything that most people cherish: a well-paying job, a good name, a comfortable lifestyle, an untroubled family life, social standing in the community, a secure future. And he denied himself. He let them go for the sake of some greater, something that he knew was more important. And here's the painful truth that Jesus wants his followers to understand. Until you and I embrace that something greater, until we discover something worth dying for, we are not really living. And on the second Sunday of our Lenten sermon series entitled The Way of the Cross, I've struggled with this week's theme of following. What does it mean to take up my cross? What is Jesus really trying to get at? I mean, life is really good for me. I've got a wonderful, successful, loving wife. I adore my children in spite of the fact that sometimes they act like me. My family is healthy. We have a nice home. I have not lost my job. I'm grateful for my call as a pastor to lead, guide, and direct God's people here. I love the energy and spirit and growth that God is giving us at Starmount. All this is to say that the difficulties come for everyone, but I'm genuinely a happy person. So what does it mean for me with a good life to deny myself, to take up my cross and follow Jesus? Well, I've been thinking about that a great deal. And while I don't have many final answers, I've decided that it means at least this much. It means that when I preach, when I teach, when I lead, I can not only say the things that lead people to say, "Nice sermon, Pastor," when they shake my hand at the door on the way out of the service. It means that I have to speak the truth in love, even if it means that no one will say, "Nice sermon." I have to talk about the hard things that we are called to do in order to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Hard things like turning the other cheek, not letting the sun go down on our anger, caring for the least and the lost and the lonely. I have to talk about the hard people with whom we are called to share the good news of God's love. Prisoners, widows, children, strangers, illegal immigrants, the poor, the homeless. Taking up my cross means that I have to think about Starmount Church in terms of mission. What are we doing to serve the people who have never even stepped into church? What are we doing to love the same kind of people that Jesus loved? And not simply maintenance. What are we doing to keep things pretty and nice and comfortable for our members? I have to care as much about feeding hungry people as about meeting the church's budget. I have to love the people who need the church as well as those who support the church. Taking up my cross means I have to help the Starmount Church family learn to care not just for one another, but for those who have no family. I have to do the hard things like give away money that I'd rather keep, talk about what faith means when I'd rather be silent, and do good for people who will never do good for me in return. I have to think more of loving than being loved, more of understanding than being understood, more of forgiving than being forgiven. I don't know exactly what it means to follow Christ for you. Carrying a cross takes a variety of forms. Worshiping God on Sunday morning at church at the risk of being bored when the world waits to be endlessly entertained. Turning the other cheek when you're being run down or nitpicked to death. Spending time with people who seem to have nothing to offer you. Standing with people who are losing. Caring for those who have made terrible mistakes. Doing good that will receive no applause. Sharing food with the hungry. Becoming a better friend to someone with an incurable disease, delivering mobile meals, emptying bedpans or diapers in a nursing home, holding hands stiffened with arthritis, sitting in a home where a member has just died, taking other people's children to the park, listening to the lonely person, treating discarded people as children of God, praying not for an easier life, but for a more faithful one, following Christ and discovering grace. It would be nice if Jesus promised that if you and I live as disciples, our reward would be good times and good health and a good deal, but there are no promises, except for this. Those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. The promise is that in the long run, Christ's followers gain much, much more than we lose.